If you cross the barrier when the train comes through, you will be arrested for trespassing.
In February of this year, 7 southwestern Idaho residents were arrested while protesting the passage through Idaho of a train that they say was carrying nuclear warheads. A similar train is on its way again, with another protest planned tonight. Good evening. At 8 o'clock tonight, a group of Canyon County residents will gather near a Union Pacific Railroad crossing in Nampa to hold what they're calling a teach-in and vigil. The group, the Canyon County Citizens for Peace, had been planning the gathering to coincide with the passage of a train that they say carries nuclear warheads. Apparently that train, dubbed the White Train, will not now come through southern Idaho, but will instead cross the Idaho Panhandle in the far northern part of the state on the rail line that runs through Sandpoint, the passage possibly coming tomorrow. In February, when a similar train did cross southern Idaho, it was met by small groups of demonstrators all across the state. The groups are protesting the nuclear arms race. Anti-nuclear activists say the trains transport nuclear weapons components from a plant in Texas to the U.S. Navy's Trident submarine base on Puget Sound in Washington state. The group is vowing tonight not to break any laws with the vigil, and instead has invited area political candidates to attend and talk about their views on the nuclear arms race. The Reverend Nathaniel Pierce of Nampa has been an organizer of the White Train vigils. He was one of those arrested for trespassing in February when the train last crossed Idaho. Now, Reverend Pierce, if there's no train to protest tonight, what do you hope to accomplish?
Well, basically, we're sponsoring a forum or an opportunity for public officials, and particularly those who are standing for election this year, to come and share their point of view. The focus of the February demonstration that you had on the tape a moment ago was basically to raise consciousness about the fact that the White Train, which has traveled through this part of Idaho for almost 20 years now unnoticed, is in fact coming through our communities with these bombs. And I think we succeeded in that goal. I think most people now in this area know that the White Train travels through this area. Tonight, we hope to participate more in an educational forum, to listen to people's views on this, perhaps if there's an opportunity to dialogue with them.
Now, you thought, I take it until sometime earlier today, that the train might really come through southern Idaho again, but it's not now. Why?
Well, our first tip-off that the train wasn't coming to Nampa was yesterday morning when we called the Nampa police chief, and he said that he hadn't received word that the train was coming, and normally he's notified. And indeed, we now have definite word that it's taking the northern route. It should be in Sandpoint, Idaho. We estimate at 1:30 Thursday afternoon. The reason it's not coming, and we have this from the headquarters of this whole movement in Seattle, is in fact a result of the demonstrations here in February.
So they've rerouted it on the basis of the demonstration where you and some other folks were arrested in
Absolutely,
February.
yeah. In fact, now the train will not go through Colorado because of the massive demonstrations that were there last summer and fall. And now they are apparently avoiding southern Idaho and trying to find the route of least resistance.
Do you expect some protest in Sandpoint?
Well, as a matter of fact, that's being organized tonight and tomorrow. And yes, I suspect there will be some protests in Sandpoint. I don't know if there'll be civil disobedience, but I'm sure there'll be some demonstrations there.
Local people in the Sandpoint area or from this part of the state too?
Well, mostly the northern Idaho from Coeur d'Alene, Lewiston, Moscow on up. I wouldn't be surprised if several carloads of people might travel from southern Idaho.
Well, let me ask you this finally. You and others were fairly heavily criticized, I think it's fair to say, for the civil disobedience that you engaged in back in February. And even before you knew that this train was not coming through tonight, you had said that civil disobedience would not be part of this protest. Why?
Well, it's hard to do two things at once. The focus of the February witness was primarily to raise consciousness and to make a strong statement of where we stood. The focus of our efforts this time is basically educational in nature, and it's hard to carry on an educational endeavor while civil disobedience is going on. So we felt that on this particular...
Excuse me, you want to educate people on the fact that this train exists, or that it's carrying nuclear weapons, or is there a larger message in your education?
Well, mainly I think to explore what the White Train symbolizes in terms of the nuclear arms race, how it affects our lives, and why perhaps more citizens of Canyon County might want to be concerned about that.
Was it counterproductive earlier, the civil disobedience?
Well, that's a matter of opinion. I still feel very good about what we did in February, and I feel that our witness indeed gave the passage of the White Train the kind of publicity that has long been lacking in this area.
We'll come back, sir. Thank you. Few people will likely disagree with Reverend Pierce concerning the dangers of the nuclear arms race. There are those, however, who will take issue with the way the group has protested the arms race. One who takes issue is Ralph Smead, a Caldwell businessman, a newspaper columnist, and a leader of the group, the Center for Market Alternatives, a Caldwell organization that advocates market, not government solutions to many of our problems. Mr. Smead, I understand you're planning to attend tonight as well. Why?
Well, I think the thing has been so horribly one-sided. I think that it's a kind of an asinine maneuver simply because it's so one-sided. I have to hand it to Father Pierce and his little band of zealous followers, because they're concerned about this thing. Anybody didn't concerned, to my way of thinking, is taking leave of their senses. But the protest is all on one side. The protest is, seems to me to be entirely at the United States, and there's no protest for the other side, and this is a two-way fight, as I'm sure even you know. And having been to just Russia recently, that may give you a new burst of insight there, I'd hope so. But it seems to me that the news media rushes out there when these clowns get out there and protest about this dang train. And to my way of thinking, I think that it doesn't matter whether they fly the bombs out here or whether they come on this train. I have to hand it to these people. I'm sorry to give them this much credit, but I don't see a band of conservatives out there, you see, protesting, and I think they should be, or maybe some of the rest of us that don't call ourselves conservatives exactly ought to be. But it takes two to make this big international arms race, and I think that protest ought to be leveled at the other side. I think that the butchers in China, and in Red China that is, and in Russia ought to be protested against, and I thought maybe I ought to try to do something so the other side could be heard.
Well, you heard Reverend Pierce say that the purpose of tonight's gathering was largely educational, to educate people about the arms race. Not an appropriate thing?
Oh, I heard him say that, but he wants to educate one side. I want to educate the other side, I think, maybe.
Well, how do we do that?
Well, I don't know. Given the way the news media has this short-range mentality that they have, I suppose some people on the other side have to go out here and make idiots of themselves in order to get the attention of people like yourself and the other TV media. And frankly, I think that the coverage of these things, I would like to fault Father Pierce and his little band, but I can't really fault them. But except that they tell one side only, and I think in that sense, I think it's an unfortunate thing. But how do we make the side for peace newsworthy? Well, people other than Father Pierce and his group, I think haven't done a very good job, and so I thought maybe I'd try and do something about it.
Do you take issue with the civil? Obviously, I would assume that you take issue with the civil disobedience that they engaged in February.
Well, if you mean that I take issue because they break the law, I don't know. It seems to me much ado about nothing. No, I'd sooner that if Father Pierce fancies himself something of a protester in favor of people that take minority positions. But you see, if he were really consistent about that, he'd be out there demonstrating, sitting on the railroad track or the highway someplace for George Hanson and some of the people that really smell a police state. And I think that's what they should be. And if he were honest, and I think if you'd press him, that he'd probably tell you so. I'm not sure.
Well, I will press him in just a second. Let me ask you one final thing. If I understand your argument, it is basically that such demonstrations would be all right if the demonstrations were also leveled against the other major user or possessor of nuclear weapons in this world.
That'd be a help, but that's not really what I think. The thing is not about ideas. We go around the world and the Russians act and we react. And I think that we ought to be trying to sell ideas, but we don't. As a matter of fact, I think the non-liberals in this country have been behind the door here for too long. And I'm trying to get this on an idea basis. I think that, well, for example, Karl Marx did a lot of promising, and about the only one that seemed to learn anything from him is the U.S. politicians. They promised too. But Adam Smith didn't promise anything, but he delivered what Karl Marx only promised. And I'd like to get it on that basis. And this arms race thing, I think anybody that you'd ask, any thoughtful person would agree it's insane. But what do you do when somebody comes at you with a smoking gun? And the aggressiveness of the Russian and the Chinese butchers, I think, is well known into the millions of people that they've slaughtered because of their dissenters. And fortunately, I'm tickled to death that Father Pierce can dissent in this country and not be shot.
Well, let me go back to Father Pierce and let you argue out a couple of these points. I think I'm understanding Mr. Smead to say that you're too one-sided in your protest.
Well, at one level, I think that's a fair criticism. After all, peace will only come if all people involved make serious steps towards that. But the problem, it seems to me, with Americans is that we tend to focus in on the aggressiveness of the enemy and not see how our own actions may be interpreted as being aggressive by others. The deployment, for example, of the cruise missiles in Europe is comparable to the way we saw the missiles in Cuba in the 60s. The Russians see those cruise and Pershing missiles in the same way and feel as threatened as we did in the 60s with the missiles in Cuba. And part of the work for peace, and this, of course, is part of the Christian tradition, is to see the error of your own ways first before you try and correct your neighbor. Now, that's not to say that we should take steps that will put us at risk with our enemies, but it is to recognize that while maintaining our security, there are some independent initiatives that could be undertaken that might lessen the danger somewhat. So I think...
But by the nature of your protest, it has to be unilateral. It has to be directed toward the political process in this country, right?
Indeed, I'd say that's true, but it's even more significant than that. The Trident missile is a first-strike weapon and therefore inherently destabilizing. And therefore, these particular bombs on this particular train headed for the Trident missile base in Washington is very significant because of its first-strike capability and the dangers that poses to deterrence.
Mr. Smead, comment?
Well, it's interesting that people of Father Pierce's persuasion tend to encourage people, in my opinion, to worship government problem solving. And that's what this missile thing is government problem solving.
How so?
Well, private people aren't manufacturing missiles, the government's manufacturing missiles. And I think that what we ought to do, we ought to be selling ideas, since when have you heard of the U.S. government selling ideas? And when, if they did have a good idea, which I doubt, it wouldn't be newsworthy to you fellas, how do you make that newsworthy? Father Pierce knows how to make the news, and that seems to be attractive to you fellas, and hence we're here. Sorry about that.
That's where we agree. I would much rather see us trying to sell ideas than selling weapons and manufacturing weapons to try and bring security. I think ideas would be far more effective.
Well, maybe if you wouldn't push government ideas, maybe we'd do that.
Well, what about, just finally, about Mr. Smead's point that too much attention has been given your group relative to your size and the message that you carry? Too much attention by people like me, for example.
Well, I've been surprised at the extensive media coverage on this, and yet...
obviously, you set out to encourage coverage.
Yes, that's true. But the extent of it, I think, was caught us even by surprise. And yet I find that people are indeed interested in what's going on, and it's not something that the media has manufactured, but indeed this is an issue that seems to have touched people all across the country. It was even written up in People magazine, and what better proof of, you know, some kind of thing catching on than being in People magazine. It's that kind of phenomenon that seems to be at work here.
We'll come back, gentlemen. Thank you. At least 2 Canyon County legislative candidates who will face each other on the ballot in November plan to show up at the vigil tonight. Jerry Thorne, a Republican from Nampa, who will oppose State Senator Terry Riley of Nampa in November. He's the Democratic candidate. Both will attend tonight. Senator Riley, why?
Well, primarily because a group of people asked that elected officials come to this education session, this vigil. And I think that it's appropriate that as an elected state senator to go at their request.
Do you expect to learn something or say something or bring some message?
I hope to learn something, and I've been asked to say something. And so I would just like to better understand some of the concepts and the ideas which they are discussing, as well as express some of my own ideas.
Mr. Thorne, what's your reason for going tonight?
Well, primarily because I had a very kind invitation, and I'm in a position, I think, where I can't refuse the opportunity to work with all groups of people, all factions, all ideas. It's time for me to make my views known and make my stand very obvious to people, and I look forward to the opportunity to be there tonight and present a statement also.
Well, let me just ask both of you, do you agree with what Reverend Pierce and his group are trying to do? Mr. Thorne?
No, not really. I really don't agree with it. As a matter of fact, my first reaction when I heard the train wasn't coming through, isn't it too bad that a railroad train doesn't feel now that it can pass safely or through the city of Nampa. I think that's unfortunate. There are jobs in Nampa with railroaders, railroading being a major concern in Nampa, and I'm sure this affects the jobs of some of our people there, and it just kind of upsets me now that the railroad doesn't really feel like it's safe to come through Nampa. They have to go through northern Idaho.
Senator Riley, how do you feel about what Reverend Pierce and his group are trying to do?
Well, what he says they are trying to do is to have a discussion about the nuclear issue. And as Mr. Smead said, he would be there and hope to have a balanced discussion about it. I think that's very appropriate to have a discussion about it, and hopefully people will better understand the complexity.
How do you feel about the fact that apparently these demonstrations in February are going to prevent the train from going through Canyon County?
Well, certainly the train going through Canyon County places Canyon County at a certain degree of risk. You are carrying some weapons, which certainly if there could be an accident, which is probably what will happen at some point in this entire nuclear insanity, that we're placing people at risk. And I think that it is appropriate for the community people to express a feeling and a thought, and this is what they have done, and people are hearing it.
Mr. Thorne?
Well, of course, we're told that there's no risk involved, but I'd have to agree with Senator Riley that probably is a possibility. But I don't think it's a very strong possibility that anything like that would happen. I just feel like that we'd ought to have an open shot for the government in their efforts to strengthen our defenses so that we can deter anyone from attacking our shores, or at least to discourage them, should have the opportunity to move their arsenal wherever they want to move it. I strongly believe that we have smart men in this country. I put my name on the ballot in favor of President Reagan 4 years ago, and I still feel very strongly that he's doing a good job for our nation, and I support him and those who work with him in the strength and defense of this nation. And if they feel like that they can't safely bring the train through Nampa, that really upsets me quite a bit.
Senator Riley?
I think that we need to look at the difference between trends and fads. I think you would say Michael Jackson's a fad. It's something that's imposed from top down. What we are experiencing throughout the entire world, I think, is a significant trend where people from grassroots are becoming very concerned about something. And like all trends, that when that grows and grows and more people understand the issue, then the people at the top will get the message. And I think it is appropriate for people to become more enlightened about this issue. We see it happening not only throughout the entire United States, but throughout the entire world. And I think that that's a positive measure.
Well, let me just ask both of you gentlemen finally, and then we'll open it up again. You heard the discussion on this side of the table about the protest being too one-sided, directed only against the government in this country and its policies. True, Senator?
Oh, I don't know that it's a matter of being one-sided or not. They have better articulated their position in opposition to the nuclear issue than the other side has articulated it. And as Mr. Smead says, the responsibility is with the other side, whatever that is, to express their opinions. And therefore, I think it's appropriate that locally elected people would try to understand that.
Mr. Thorne?
Oh, I think it's definitely one-sided. There isn't any question about that. And I agree with Mr. Smead that really the one side is going through all this only to get the attention of the news media, because that's the thing that the news media seems to eat up, and they can always count on there being reporters and television cameras and whatever else out there on the site to get their story across, and their story is pretty one-sided. Now, maybe I'm same time faulting myself for being on the other side and not being vocal. Tonight I intend to make a statement of my feelings on this, and again appreciate the opportunity.
Is, Reverend Pierce, is this what you expect, this sort of dialogue?
Absolutely, sure. And in fact, it's somewhat disappointing in a way that the dialogue hasn't happened before now. But it's, I think, a sign of growing maturity and concern that the dialogue can begin and hopefully continue tonight. And perhaps the media attention and the White Train itself helps make that happen. I write a column for the Press Tribune each week. I've been writing about this issue now for 4 years. But the White Train has helped bring it together in a way that nothing else seemed to do that. And I feel that the dialogue is important, and what makes a dialogue work is the willingness to listen really hard to each other. Sometimes I feel the arguments go across like this. Someone will make a point and someone else makes another point, and it really doesn't get engaged. And I would hope that one of the issues tonight we'll hear discussed is the question of first strike, and why the United States seems unwilling to go on record as saying we will never be the first to use nuclear weapons. Now, I know the conservatives will say, well, you know, the Russians ought to make a similar commitment before we do. And of course, we come back and say, well, they already have. And they say, well, you can't believe them. And there you are. But I think that's the kind of dialogue I hope we might get into. Don't you, Ralph?
Well, I wanted to say something else before you get to that. I didn't want to overlook saying I appreciate the opportunity here to express a few thoughts in a terribly brief time, Mark. I appreciate that. But, and I don't want your viewers to think that, at least in my case, that I think it's all bad that you people fall all over yourselves when Nat comes out with his protesters, because it isn't all bad. At least there's this much good about it. At least the news media is not out distorting the facts on some other important issue. So there's some good to come of it. But while I say that partly in jest, I also say it partly in truth. And Nat talks about first strike weapon, and that's a crock. If you got anything that's going to have a weapon, it's going to blow up, it's going to hurt somebody. What's the difference between a first strike and a second strike? Probably won't be any second strike anyway. You'll get the first strike in, probably wins the war if you can win a nuclear war. I don't know whether you can or not. But the thing that's, I just have to say that people on my side of the fence, I'm not sure exactly what sort of a label to use in this case, is I'm against both sides. But I do think that the people on the, let's say the non-U.S. government protesters like Father Pierce have been shy, particularly where the idea is, well, okay, so you know what you're against, what are you for? And I'm suggesting that we can mount a tremendous offense in this country. How to sell limited government and a free market and, let's say, capitalism, Adam Smith.
Well, let me ask you a direct question, though, that relates to the discussion taking place here, it seems to me. How, if you believe that these weapons are the worst thing in the world right now, how do you protest those effectively without doing the kinds of things that Reverend Pierce and his group are doing? How do you balance the protest, I guess? You're saying it's too one-sided. How do we engage in a protest against these weapons that covers all the bases that you'd like to see covered?
Well, I think you're asking the wrong fellow. I should have somebody in the news media to ask, why is it so newsworthy? To my way of thinking, it's not all that newsworthy. But I have to agree with Nat. I have to agree, against my better judgment. But I have to agree that the protest in the white train has focused the thing a little bit, even if the news media gets too far out on it. What I'm trying to say is that I think that it's inconsistent for Father Pierce and people of his persuasion to push government problem solving all the time for everything, the taxes and for poverty and for everything, and then not expect people to follow along and think the government has to solve this thing in the military sense too. I think it's terribly inconsistent, and I would suggest that the way to overcome that is to get off of this kick of, and I have to agree with Nat in this case, of building armaments to sell what? I don't know.
Senator Riley?
I don't think it's a matter of the news media playing up to the issue unduly. Certainly, as I talk with people in Canyon County, people are very concerned about this issue. I go into classrooms, and it's one of the foremost issues on the minds of young children. I talk with young parents who have children who will be going off to military. They're extremely concerned about this. I think that when we look at the polls taken by Representative Craig, as well as Christian Science Monitor polls and Gallup polls, the American people and the people in Idaho are deeply concerned about this issue. I think it is appropriate to have an exchange of ideas, and if the media so chooses to cover it, then that is their business. But I don't think that we should criticize the media for covering an issue which is of a tremendous amount of concern to the public.
Terry, if you believe in a dialogue, how are you going to have a dialogue that's so one-sided? The media can't see anything except the two liberals who disagree.
Yeah,
they think that's both sides.
But whose fault is that? I mean, where are the conservatives? Why don't the conservatives come out and dialogue with another point of view? It's very hard to, I mean, just let me speak from personal feeling. It's very hard, as you know, in Nampa, to find a conservative that you can dialogue with when there's sharp disagreement. Usually they walk off in a huff. And I find that very frustrating. It's very hard, and I value your friendship so much because you and I do disagree on so much, and yet we're friends. But to my experience, that's the exception. And one of the tragedies on this and so many other issues is people are divided in different camps and they don't talk to one another. And that's the joy of being a priest, because you have all of those people in your congregation on Sunday morning.
Well, in defense of the conservatives...
I got 10 seconds is all.
Well, one of the reasons probably is some of them walk off is because your argument doesn't make very much sense.
Well, on that note, I'm going to have to say that if you want to hear more of this, you can go to the railroad tracks at 8 o'clock tonight.
Midland Crossing.
Midland Crossing. Reverend Pearson, Mr. Smead, we thank you for being with us. Senator Riley, Mr. Thorne, thank you, gentlemen. That's our time for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. I'm Mark Johnson. Good night.
Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.